Right. I think we've reached critical mass. So hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Utica's Olmsted Footprint Then and Now. I'm Sue Breitkoff, the new president of the Olmsted Network, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's conversation. At the Olmsted Network, we work to lift up the legacy of landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, his sons, and the Olmsted firm through education, advocacy, and other forms of support. And the Olmsted legacy endures in meaningful ways in Utica, New York. And today you will hear the history of the Olmsted Brothers' early 20th century parks and residential projects in Utica, including recent efforts to rehabilitate Frederick T. Proctor Park. We're thrilled to be joined by Philip Bean, who has earned degrees from Union College, Oxford University, and the University of Rochester, and served as a dean at Harvard and Haverford colleges. An American historian by training, he has published on the history of immigration, ethnic nationalism, urban politics, notably the Urban Colonists, Italian identity and politics in Utica. Philip has held lectureships at Hamilton and Harvard colleges, excuse me, and was associate editor for European immigration history for the Encyclopedia of New York State. He is currently retired, or I would say probably minimally retired, but serves as president of Olmsted City of Greater Utica. And with that, I want to turn things over to Philip Bean. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Sue. Let me get myself oriented here. All right, so again, welcome and thank you for joining for this overview of the history and recent efforts to rehabilitate part of Utica's Olmsted footprint. This footprint consists of a 620-acre parks and parkway system that was largely designed by Olmsted Brothers and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and 5 residential subdivisions also designed by Olmsted Brothers. Utica occupies 16.7 square miles, half the land area of Manhattan, and about a tenth of this city was designed by Olmsted Brothers, mostly between 1906 and 1927. And although Utica's Olmsted era was largely over by the mid to late 1920s, the firm was intermittently involved in projects in Utica through the 1930s and as late as the early 1950s. First, some background. Beginning in the 1840s, Utica evolved into one of the largest textile manufacturing centers in the United States. It prospered economically and experienced population growth by double-digit percentages until the 1920s. Already by the late 19th century, however, Utica was falling behind. Unlike other leading upstate industrial centers, it failed to transition from its entry-level industry, textiles, to the cutting-edge industries of the late 19th century, like chemicals, optics, and electrical machinery. In addition, Utica's population grew from 44,000 to 56,000 in the 1890s, on its way to eventually expanding to 100,000 in 1930, but as of the mid-1890s, it had only 7 acres of public parkland. Most of Utica's elites seem to have been unaware of or complacent about these matters, but Thomas R. Proctor, the person who initiated Utica's Olmsted era, believed both that Utica's appearance and its quality of life were inconsistent with hopes for a bright future. Beginning in 1899, he therefore spent much of the last 2 decades of his life trying to do something to change Utica's trajectory. Proctor, shown here as a boy with his father, was born in Vermont, but grew up in Boston where his father was a businessman. Thomas spent much of his youth within walking distance of the Boston Common and the Boston Public Gardens, 75 acres of the finest urban public parkland in the country. To give context, Olmsted and Vaux's design for Central Park in New York City wasn't even chosen until 1858, when Proctor was 14 years old. And before he left Boston in 1867, Proctor witnessed the onset of the construction of Commonwealth Avenue, a boulevard with a tree-lined, grassy median, one of many such boulevards that made a lasting impression on his imagination. In short, his upbringing in Boston was one of several experiences that prepared Proctor to become an advocate for and builder of public parks. A few years after returning from the Civil War, Proctor moved to Utica, the 8th most populous city in New York, the wealthiest and most populous state in the Union. His family, including his father, had generations of experience as innkeepers and hotel owners, and in 1869, the 25-year-old Proctor acquired one of the 2 largest and most respected hotels in Utica, and later in the 1870s, he acquired Utica's other comparably large, well-regarded hotel. However, it was his experience in a spa town called Richfield Springs, about 25 miles to the southeast of Utica, that would help transform him into a public parks builder. In 1875, he bought the Spring House, a small inn shown here, and he not only expanded it greatly and modernized it, but more importantly for our story, he intensively landscaped its 5-acre grounds so that it was like a park. And what's more, he encouraged other hotel and inn owners in Richfield Springs to emulate his example. By the 1880s, the New York Times and other prominent publications acknowledged that Richfield Springs, previously a bit of a backwater, if you will, had been transformed into a spa resort town that could compete with Saratoga for elite clientele, a fact many attributed to Proctor's campaign to transform the landscape of the entire town. The third experience that transformed him into a public parks builder was his role as a founder and vice president of a company that built and operated a commercial park in Utica in the 1870s and 80s. Such commercial parks, or picnic groves, which people often paid a fee to enter even if they simply wanted to picnic, were common before free urban parks became more widespread. As with Richfield Springs, this park was recognized in national circulation publications as a strikingly beautiful destination. Up to this point, the late 1880s, Proctor had been building and managing landscapes for profit as commercial enterprises, and he was also enjoying public parks as a consumer in his travels across the U.S. In 1891, having accumulated a small fortune, he married one of the wealthiest women in central New York. While continuing to serve on corporate boards and as president of a local bank, he divested himself of his hotels, went into semi-retirement, and for several years he and his wife, Maria Watson Williams, shown here, enjoyed being newlyweds and their shared interests, notably in travel. Together they experienced the great American and European boulevards and urban public parks. And here is Proctor in what I believe to be Kensington Gardens in London, which was another source of inspiration to him. However, Proctor became restless. He had a strong creative impulse. So in 1899, he decided that with his days as a builder and manager of commercial landscapes behind him, he would now work to have landscapes built for the free enjoyment of the people of Utica. At first, however, he tried to persuade the city to build parks at taxpayer expense, but he got pushback, a lot of pushback. So he decided to lead by example. Drawing on his previous experiences, he designed and supervised the creation of a 60-acre park on the site of a former farm he owned on Utica's east side. This creation eventually became known as Thomas R. Proctor Park, and it is the only significant element in Utica's 620-acre parks and parkway system on which Olmsted Brothers did not do any work. Although T.R. Proctor Park remained Proctor's private property until 1909, he opened it in the interim to the public for their free use, and it was a huge hit. Proctor was consequently bitten by the park building bug, so he then purchased two 17-acre sites on the west side of Utica that he transformed into simple parks, albeit more glorified playgrounds than anything else. Then he also began campaigning for the creation of a park-like boulevard running east-west across Utica's southern and eastern periphery that would both tie the parks together as an intentional, more accessible system and open up underdeveloped lands to transformation into residential neighborhoods to sustain population growth. Proctor, in short, was just getting started. In the opening years of the 20th century, he then assembled 250 acres of farmland, which he would eventually expand to 385 acres, on Utica's southern periphery that he decided to transform into what he initially called the Valley View Park, but Proctor decided in 1907 to call Roscoe Conkling Park instead. He plunged into supervising work on this new project himself, just as he had with similar projects since the 1870s. But those projects were also far, far smaller, and they weren't largely perched on the side of a hill as is Conkling Park. In short, Thomas R. Proctor had finally met his match. In January 1906, a friend therefore introduced Proctor to Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and thus began over 2 decades of fairly intensive work by Olmsted Brothers in Utica. Olmsted first visited the Conkling Park site in the spring of 1906, and like Proctor, he was taken by it. After haggling about prices and packages, Proctor was wealthy, but he was always looking for a bargain. In August 1906, Olmsted Brothers produced a plan for the park. Olmsted himself visited the site quite a few times and even staked some of the roads himself, but in this and all other projects in Utica through the late 1920s, his principal point man for Utica was Edward C. Whiting, who would become a partner in Olmsted Brothers on the death of John Charles Olmsted, Olmsted Jr.'s brother, in 1920. Whiting, Olmsted, and other members of the Olmsted Brothers firm were actively involved in and often on site at the Conkling Park project in 1906 to 1909, and then intermittently thereafter as late as 1913. For the most part, the recommendations of Olmsted Brothers were implemented, albeit after Olmsted and Proctor had come to a meeting of the minds about first principles. Olmsted had originally advocated strongly for making Conkling Park a passive, pastoral, or country park in which people were expected to stroll and commune quietly with nature and stay on the paths. In his earliest meeting with Proctor, Whiting tried to reinforce this vision for the park by explaining to Proctor why he should not want such features as baseball fields and bandstands in this park. Proctor listened politely, but he disregarded these observations. He wanted his park to be an active one. He wanted children and even adults to run around and get exercise in every conceivable way, and he did not intend to tell them to keep off the grass. As he usually did, Olmsted decided to deal with the client he had. But between the two men, there was a lot of give and take. There was plenty of room to accommodate both visions in this 385-acre behemoth, which became a hybrid of their visions, and so it remains to this day. And over time, Olmsted had an impact on Proctor's views, which can be seen in their last collaboration together, Frederick T. Proctor Park, which we will discuss later. Conkling Park consists of 4 distinctive landscapes. The South Woods, the only significantly wooded area that predated the park, which otherwise had been open farmland. The Olmsted plan created switchback roads zigzagging up through old-growth forest to the highest elevations in the park, some 900 feet above sea level. Utica's general elevation is around 400 feet. And here are some pictures of the switchbacks today. The second landscape was a large rolling meadow on the park's east side. Olmsted admired the spot for its expanses of natural wildflowers and the pleasant views of the nearby reservoirs. He therefore suggested merely planting trees to complement this meadow and creating some paths through it, and this is initially what was done with it. However, in 1925, this area was transformed into another sort of meadow, a golf course, broadly according to a plan by a noted early course designer, Walter Travis. The course was then redesigned and slightly expanded by yet another renowned American golf course designer, Robert Trent Jones, in the late 1930s. And the course is used even in winter today for cross-country skiing and snowshoeing when there's sufficient snow. The third landscape consisted of several elevated viewing areas, offering beautiful vistas of the Mohawk Valley, the city of Utica, and the foothills of the Adirondacks. Proctor and his allies had studied cities that invested in park building, and it seems significant that they frequently mentioned Louisville, Kentucky, a city in which the Olmsteds had done considerable work designing parks and parkways and parks, notably Iroquois Park, whose overlook area offers vistas very similar to those at Conkling Park. Finally, there was the park's lower northwestern corner, which was where the playing fields, tennis courts, sledding in hills and toboggan runs, and a skating rink were created. This part of the park is still largely used for the same purposes to this day. In 1915, Proctor even envisioned downhill skiing at the park, and it began informally there as early as 1919. The city of Utica then began developing a formal ski center in the 1940s, which was expanded and modernized and was well utilized until climate change altered the amount and consistency of snowfall in Utica. While all this was being built, Proctor simultaneously drew Olmsted into his machinations to compel City Hall to build a 4-mile boulevard or parkway running east-west across Utica's southern and eastern periphery. Already by June 1906, Olmsted had produced a design for such a parkway at Proctor's request and expense, even though there was still insufficient political support for building it. Proctor had a plan, though, for outflanking the political opposition. He began by engineering the creation of a special Chamber of Commerce committee on improving and beautifying Utica, saw to the installation of a young ally as that committee's chair, and that man in turn saw to it that Olmsted Jr. was hired to serve as a consultant to the committee. Olmsted's subsequent report on Utica, based on 3 weeks of visits by Olmsted to Utica specifically for this purpose — Olmsted was in and out of Utica quite a bit between 1906 and 1913 — the report was submitted in February 1907 and released publicly in October 1908, making it one of the first urban planning studies Olmsted Brothers completed. Among the many things it recommended for Utica just happened to be one to create an east-west parkway, such as Proctor had advocated for years. Proctor had already created greater momentum behind his plans for Utica by donating 4 parks, including Conklin Park and Thomas R. Proctor Park, to the city of Utica in the fall of 1907. This immensely popular move, buttressed by the publication of Olmsted's report in 1908, created public pressure that compelled City Hall to agree the parkway, which happened in stages between 1909 and 1919, albeit not without some periodic snags. Both Olmsted and his firm needed to do some fancy footwork several times during the construction of the parkway, indeed from day one. The plan called for the pavement and expansion of the only major east-west road on the upper south side of Utica, called Pleasant Street, a decidedly unpleasant old dirt road. The plan called for a construction of a new road running parallel to Pleasant Street for the first half of the 4-mile boulevard, and between Pleasant and this new road would be a grassy tree-lined median. And that median, the new construction, and Pleasant Street together would come collectively to be known as the Parkway. Olmsted's original plan was to place this new road mostly north of Pleasant Street, but property owners along the proposed northern route refused to sell. Olmsted strongly advocated against the use of eminent domain to compel landowners to sell their land, and both Proctor and the city accepted that advice, so the new road was built to the south of Pleasant rather than to the north, according to plans progressively redrafted by Olmsted Brothers between 1908 and 1910. And here are some early views of the first half mile or so of the parkway from between around 1915 and 1925. Well, as if all this were not enough, in 1911, Proctor launched yet another project. He bought 62 acres of land, only blocks from Thomas R. Proctor Park, at what would become the eastern terminus of the parkway, to create yet another park. He decided to name this park in honor of his half-brother, Frederick T. Proctor. However, instead of hiring Olmsted Brothers to design this new park, Proctor initially hired Bryant Fleming, a founding member of the landscape architecture program at Cornell University and the designer of state parks in New York, notably at Watkins Glen in the Finger Lakes. Proctor had met Fleming while he was visiting Utica on other business in 1911, and Proctor decided that, given Fleming's reputation and the likelihood that Fleming would charge less than Olmsted Brothers, he would give Fleming a try. The relationship did not last long, though. He dismissed Fleming and called Olmsted Brothers in to take over the project in November 1912. Within weeks thereafter, Olmsted first visited the site over several days, and then he returned with Whiting and visited for a few more days, and on both occasions he took stock of the geography and the little work that had been done on the site up to that point. Frederick T. Proctor Park was the masterpiece of the Olmsted-Proctor collaboration, and in it we see how Proctor had come around to embrace Olmsted's vision for pastoral parks for Utica. Its 62 acres were, as they are now, divided into 5 distinct zones: the upper level and its rolling approximately 15-acre meadow, the Lily Pond Plateau, named for a cement reflecting pool located there, The lower level, which at one time had two ponds, one of which, shown here, was designed by Olmsted Brothers and built by Proctor at some expense. A ravine, which had two large staircases built of boulders leading to a pathway along a brook. And then finally, the north side, a portion on the other side of the creek that runs through both Thomas R. Proctor and Frederick T. Proctor parks. There are a few observations about all this. Fleming had proposed creating a cement reflecting pool on the plateau, a formal element that Proctor evidently desired. But Olmsted Brothers, when they came on the job, decided to pivot the site of the pool 90 degrees to the west of where Fleming had proposed to put it. The change of orientation was done so that the hill delineating the plateau from the park's upper level would become a backdrop to the pool, rather than a road. Olmsted Brothers also saw an opportunity to use natural springs in the hill as a way of feeding the pool, which became known as the Lily Pond. In addition, rather than place a formal stone edging around the perimeter of the lily pond, the Olmsted designed for a lawn or turf to slope gently downward to the water. This gave what was essentially a formal concrete reflecting pool an arguably somewhat strangely naturalized look. Strange in that the Olmsteds would have agreed with the dictum of the 18th century English landscaper William Kent, who said, "Nature abhors a straight line." In other words, a perfectly rectangular body of water would not look, therefore, all that natural, even if it was surrounded by a sloping lawn. In any case, within a few years, and for reasons not known, but we can speculate about, the sloping lawn was replaced with a formal stone or masonry cap around the perimeter of the pond. Regarding the lower level, there were originally two ponds down there. Both ponds were removed by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, the Federal Unemployment Relief Program, in the 1930s as part of an effort to reduce periodic flooding. The first pond was built according to a design created by Olmsted Brothers that entailed widening a creek bed and then creating a concrete but elaborately naturalized dam and waterfall. And here's that dam and waterfall and the pond in the background as it appeared in its heyday. And here, alas, is what it looks like now. The origins of the second pond are murky, but it seems that it predated the park. And this is what it looked like before the WPA got to it. And this is what the site looks like now. What I can say is that at the far end of this pond, there was a round domed neoclassical gazebo completed in July 1915, of which there is no reference in the Olmsted papers. It is similar, though, to another gazebo built in 1916 in Philadelphia's Olmsted-designed FDR Park, but the origin of the Philadelphia gazebo is evidently also uncertain. It's at least an interesting coincidence, though, that two similar structures appeared within 1 year of one another next to two ponds in two parks, both designed by Olmsted Brothers. Now a quick note about another aspect of our Olmsted footprint, Utica's Olmsted-designed subdivisions or neighborhoods. As Proctor and Olmsted anticipated, the creation of the parks and parkway system inspired local investors to buy farmland and underdeveloped land along and near the system to develop into residential subdivisions. The first half of the parkway was completed by 1911, but then local politicians started balking at the cost of building the second half, which was to be called Parkway East. Critics of the Olmsted plan argued that a straight road would cost less to build than one built according to Olmsted's plan, which curved sharply to the northeast, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Proctor finally got tired of the seemingly endless two-year debate at City Hall, and real estate developers along the proposed path of Parkway East were also getting impatient. So Proctor engineered a visit by Olmsted in the spring of 1913 that united Olmsted, who now enjoyed great public authority in Utica, with the real estate developers, and together with Proctor, they compelled the city to build Parkway East basically as planned by Olmsted back in 1906. These same real estate developers then hired Olmsted Brothers to design a subdivision for them at the western starting point of Parkway East. Known as Brookside Park, it originally incorporated a creek or brook as the centerpiece of the development. However, the brook overflowed seasonally, so it was eventually placed in an underground culvert, much to the puzzlement of contemporary Uticans who don't know the history of the neighborhood and wonder why a brookless neighborhood would be called Brookside. While that was moving forward, a local developer named Hugh Jones hired Olmsted Brothers to design another subdivision called Proctor Boulevard on the site of a former golf course. Proctor Boulevard was a street forked on its eastern and western ends to create two roads that curved around a water located. Olmsted Brothers designed all the features for the neighborhood, in addition to designing the building lots, the grading, the placement of power and sewer lines in the roads, the usual stuff. They also designed an elegant granite gateway to Proctor Boulevard and its street lamps, among other features. It went on the market in 1914 and was a great commercial success. Then a very small project called Talcott Road, which covers only one block, and it was designed in 1923. It remains a little jewel of a neighborhood. In the same period, Olmsted Brothers designed Sherman Gardens, one of the largest of the subdivisions. Centered on Parkway East, its building lots sold quickly, but its development was cut short by the Depression. This has led, as was the case with several of these subdivisions, to an eclectic mixture of architectural styles, with many homes dating from the 1920s and even 1930s, the post-war period, and into, in some cases, the early 1970s. Finally, the last major Olmsted Brothers project in Utica was a 150-acre subdivision called Ridgewood, which just happens to be my neighborhood from which I am broadcasting to you now, at which lots went on the market in 1927. This was the last project the developer I just mentioned a few minutes ago, Hugh Jones, who ginned up local excitement for this development by having a street naming contest, which was very 1920s, that generated an unsolicited suggestion for a slogan, which Jones adopted, "Where city and country meet." This summed up the spirit of all these neighborhoods, which were marketed as having a bucolic feel, and yet the developers emphasized that their residents would have easy access to what they then referred to as car service, or trolleys, that could whisk them quickly from these constructed countrysides to Utica's bustling downtown, which was still the center of retailing, professional services, and entertainment for a multi-county region. Utica's Olmsted neighborhoods have fared well, quite well. However, as was the case in so many other northeastern urban centers, Utica's parks and parkway system went into decline in the second half of the 20th century and was sometimes scarred, as we've seen in the case of the WPA, by intentional public policy. So now I'm going to pivot to the last part of my talk, a brief overview of the work of my organization, Olmsted City of Greater Utica, an entirely volunteer-based organization. We have no paid employees. We decided early on that although we were going to speak about the entire local Olmsted legacy in our educational efforts, we were going to focus our rehabilitation efforts on the 62-acre Frederick T. Proctor Park. This was largely because, although the whole Parks and Parkway system needs work, especially in certain spots, we made a calculation that if we were to fix something here and then something there over the expanse of a 620-acre system, nobody would notice these contributions, and the impact of our efforts on the popular consciousness about and the rehabilitation of the system would be minimal and would likely soon stall. Some of us have been working on this for 6 years, but as an organization, we didn't exist until 2021, and we incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit in 2023. One of our first major efforts centered on a large stone staircase built by the WPA in the 1930s, which was obscured as of 6 years ago by the overgrowth you see here. However, the overgrowth was the least of the problems because at the base of the staircase was a small, scraggly old patch of broken blacktop that was not only covered with weeds but submerged in a thin pool of water much of the year. At the bottom of the staircase in the center was a pipe and a broken basin to catch water coming from springs in the hillside, but we weren't confident that the broken basin or the drain pipe was the cause of all this sogginess. So we hired a stonemason to excavate at the base of the staircase, and he discovered two problems. First, there had been an L-joint pipe that was part of a system designed to carry the water from the park's upper level through the plateau and down to the lower level where the water wants to go, but this water had disintegrated, and where that pipe fit can be seen on the left-hand side of that photograph. Second, and perhaps even more challenging, was the fact that the spring water was no longer emanating principally through the little pipe at the base of the stairs. It was instead seeping out along the entire 20-foot base of the staircase. To address these problems, we not only replaced the L-joint pipe, but we constructed a 600 cubic foot French drain at the base of the staircase and then put a 200 square foot concrete patio atop it. Now, instead of this mess, we have this, which we consider an improvement. More recently, we decided to rebuild another historic staircase, one part of which was from the Olmsted era, but most of which was a WPA rebuild. The Olmsted era element was the patch of stacked slate on the left side of this photo. After Olmsted came to the site of the park for the first time in November 1912, he wrote in his field notes that he had seen a deposit of exposed shale on a hill in another part of the park, and that inspired him to propose facing all of the hardscaping in the park with stacked slate, several railroad carloads of which were brought up from Pennsylvania for this purpose. Unfortunately, stacked slate does not fare well in the climate here, so the WPA replaced all the stacked slate from the Olmsted era in the 1930s, which was mostly deteriorated, with fieldstones, except for this one surviving patch from 1913-14. In any case, when we decided to take on this project, the outer wall of the staircase had collapsed many years prior, and the stairs, as you can see in this photo on the left, were cracked, skewed, or missing altogether. So we hired a stonemason to pull down the exterior wall, rebalance the stairs, and replace missing and damaged ones, and build a concrete footer for a recreation of the WPA staircase. And now, instead of this, we have this, and the staircase is again an important part of the trail system. And then there's the lily pond, one of the most iconic, beloved spots in the whole system, even after 110 years of service began to take an obvious toll on its fabric. One wall had collapsed and was replaced about 15, 20 years ago by a very simple concrete wall, and at the same time, another wall, shown up here on the left, upper left, was in danger of collapsing, as you can see from the cracking. So what they decided to do was drop a concrete wall, retaining wall in front of that. So there were now two walls on one side of the pond, and the rest of it was pockmarked and unsightly. Since restoration was not an option, the original lily pond was too far gone. We hired an architectural firm to design not only a plan to reconstruct it, but also a winding pathway across the plateau to bring together a number of elements as a coherent whole that previously had been disconnected, including several trailheads, two small stone WPA buildings called the bathhouses, and two stone staircases, including the first one I showed you a few minutes ago. We also installed a half dozen benches and a few planting beds to accent the path, making the whole area a destination in its own right, in addition to being a new crossroads within the park. So here we see the lily pond after demolition, showing the original 1913 foundation, then the framing of the new walls, and then the pouring of the concrete. And now, instead of this, we have this, and the lily pond and its plateau is more of a draw than at any time in recent memory. Now let me show you an illustration of how our increasingly productive relationship with the city of Utica has yielded still more benefits to the local public. This was the pavilion located at the far end of the parking lot at the park. It was small, very simple, and probably built in the 70s or 80s, and really was not suitable for a park like this. The city decided several years ago to create this larger, at least somewhat more fitting pavilion in the center of the parking lot, and then they asked us to design and install planting beds in front of it, which we did over the course of 5, 6 planting days. And now many people have the first site many people have the park is a more appropriate tone setter, even though, like a lot of our work, it's more of a rehabilitation than a restoration because there was no pavilion, let alone a parking lot in the original park. We've also been devoting time to trail restoration. This one was suffering from a multiplicity of problems, mostly stemming from water management issues that affect the entire park. There's a lot more rainwater runoff than there was in 1912-14, due not only to climate change, but also the significantly increased number of paved surfaces within and around the park, as well as structures built around the park, mostly since the 1940s. As a result, the path in the upper part of this photo was waterlogged much of the year. In addition, those who braved the muck on the hill then tossed rocks and logs into the drainage ditch that was designed to carry runoff water from the upper level to the lower level. As you can see how they did this in the foreground of the photo. And we would take out the rocks and logs, and then they would put them back in. So we decided, and the problem with this was, in doing this, they not only created a primitive bridge, which was their intention, but they also unintentionally created a dam and a small swamp that became a breeding ground for insects. So we decided to build a proper footbridge over that drainage ditch, and also to create a 20-foot French drain under the downhill trail, in addition to creating a drainage ditch to the side of it. And now more people are enjoying this small but pleasant part of the park, which is home to a variety of wild shade plants. Just weeks ago, we installed wayfinding signs at the park to help the increasing number of visitors get greater enjoyment out of the park. And we printed those signs in the 6 most commonly spoken languages in Utica. Over 40 years ago, Utica started becoming a refugee resettlement center, and now this little city of 65,000 is home to speakers of at least 40 languages and dialects. You'll also see in this picture some of the 20 benches we installed at the park. There were almost no benches at the park before we started our efforts, I should note. As with the signs, our hope was that the styling of the benches would fit at least reasonably well with the vintage of the park, because we're doing our best to avoid either installing abruptly contemporary features in, or alternatively, creating a faux early 20th century feel at the park. Since 2022, we have also planted well over 3,000 perennial flowers, grasses, shrubs, and trees at the park. Of those, 135 have been trees, and we planted 70 of those trees, along with 30 shrubs, in 2 sessions last fall using the services of dozens of volunteers from the community. The objective of this undertaking was to restore the green screen, an important part of the original Olmsted design to reinforce the pastoral illusion of the park by blocking out views of the surrounding neighborhood, while also filtering out pollution, in those days from factories, but today from automobiles. As befits our aim to rehabilitate the park in a manner that's consistent with the original feel of the park and its era as possible, we consulted the original Olmsted Brothers planting list from 1913-14, and we made this planting as consistent with that palette as we could. A project that is currently slated for completion in the coming months relates to the park's ravine, the northwestern entrance to which is, as I mentioned before, flanked by striking stone staircases. The ravine is another area that was adversely affected by increased runoff. For many years, visitors who walked down these staircases found the area at their base was overgrown. And many of those who nevertheless ventured through the overgrowth would find that parts of the former path were so waterlogged for much of the year that they'd sink ankle deep in mud. So we hired a contractor about a year and a half ago to roughly regrade the ravine, because stretches of the former path had been eroded by the brook that runs through the ravine. Across and along this new simple path, we also created a half-dozen experimental drainage trenches to see if we could begin to dry out the area and bring some of the water management issues under control. This experiment has succeeded, and as a result, the city of Utica has agreed to recreate the pathway, and in so doing, it will create a system of formal drains throughout so as to keep the path as dry as possible year-round. We've also launched a multi-year effort to try to eradicate, or more realistically, bring under greater control a number of invasive species at the park, including Phragmites, Japanese knotweed, buckthorn, and multiflora rose. Finally, I want to end with a note not about Frederick T. Proctor Park, but our parkway. I've heard people involved in such work elsewhere in this country frequently lament that officials often see urban public parkland as basically open real estate on which they can build whatever they want, irrespective of the aesthetic value of such improvements, let alone whether such additions respect the intentional and insightful design of such public spaces. Here you see what used to be one of my favorite stretches of Utica's Parkway, along the northern end of Roscoe Conkling Park. I say used to be because in 2018, shortly before I returned to Utica, the New York State Power Authority came in and clear-cut a stretch of intentionally created forest along this part of the parkway, and then built a multi-level prefab stone retaining wall, atop which they built a relatively small but well-received educational center. And as if this were not sufficiently hideous, they also put up an obtrusive power transformer only yards from the road, and they have never fulfilled their promises to landscape around all this so that it would be less obtrusive to passers-by. So is this how we want something on the National Register of Historic Places to be treated? Of course, if you're listening to this, I'm likely preaching to the choir, but as they say, even the choir needs to hear some preaching. And I hope you'll remember this closing note, or if or when you're faced with a situation that could forever scar a public space you value. The haphazard way this came about and the insensitive location of this ugly structure brings to mind a quotation cited by Elizabeth Hope Cushing from Olmsted's 50th college anniversary entry. In a passage that resonates all the more with me now that my own 40th college reunion is drawing near, Olmsted wrote in 1944, quote, "Beauty seems no less important to human happiness than I used to think. Only now I'm far more concerned than I once was with the differences in the kind of use and abuse to which land is put." Close quote. What we have in smaller, lesser-known places like Utica, however much in need the original fabric might be of some loving care, is very well worth taking a stand. Especially if you come from a place like Utica, I hope you'll take to heart from seeing what a small but dedicated group of volunteers, in collaboration with local government, can accomplish when they decide to take responsibility for such gifts from the past to the present and to, we hope, the distant future. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you so much for that. I think you had a few gems in there that I love. Bitten by the park building bug might have been my favorite, but I also like sufficiently hideous, which I want to incorporate in a lot of different things. Um, so there are a few questions that just to kick some things off, if you don't mind answering. You mentioned that focusing on Frederick T. Proctor Park was intentional, just to kind of like narrow the focus and increase impact. But why specifically that park?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It was calculated. So to begin with, Conkling Park, the other very obvious, there's another group that does something called Green Utica that does work on the parkway. They plant some flowers and they're restoring the canopy on the parkway. So they're doing a fine job at that. So that's not a place we're going to operate. Conkling Park is, as I said, is a behemoth. It's a monster. And for a fledgling organization, it really wasn't realistic, we thought, to be taking that on. However, on the affirmative side of things, we decided that Frederick T. Proctor Park should be the first target because not only was it manageable, at 62 acres, it's relatively small, but it was, even in its diminished state, it was very well used. And it really served and it continues to serve a representative cross-section of this really richly diverse community. And we felt we had a constituency that clearly loved the park, who would respond to what we were doing, and they have, in fact. And anecdotally, the consensus is that usership has gone up quite dramatically over the last few years, and that people do like what we're doing. And then finally, it's also had to do with the reputation of the park. It was known as the gem of the system, the jewel, or whatever, and we wanted to bring it back to something closer to what it had been. And even though it was kind of a wreck when we started, it was, you could see the potential there was for getting it in order if we could get enough volunteers and enough donors, to be perfectly frank.
Great, great. And now we have a question from Bowden in the chat. Was there some sort of agreement when the land was donated to the city that it can never be developed and must be used as a park?
Yes. So in fact, it said in the bequest that it shall remain forever a public park for the enjoyment of the people of Utica. However, that is not inconsistent with doing some really monstrously bad things to the property, that is proactively or ruining it through neglect, has happened for many decades. So, but yes, it cannot be alienated, at least not in any easy way. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been any attempt to do that with our parks in Utica, unlike what has happened or is happening in other places.
Also, you mentioned the north side in Frederick T. Proctor Park, but can you give us a sense of what's happening on that side?
So that's it's a triangular 8 to 10 acre parcel that for which there was an elaborate Olmsted design and it was created. There was actually a second reflecting pool over there. There was a kind of what some people refer to as an infinity walk. There was a carriage circle. And this was the part of the park that was most neglected. It was completely abandoned at one point and overtaken by nature. So reclaiming is taking a lot of work, and some of us have been periodically going opportunistically when things are slow and we happen to have extra hands to go over there and clean it up. We have recreated the carriage circle. At least it's inspired by the Olmsted plan. For various reasons, we couldn't replicate the original Olmsted design exactly. And we are also going to be having a tree maintenance company go in there this year and do a number of sessions and beginning to clean things up a little bit so that as a prelude to, we hope, recreating the pathways that used to go through there. But it's a major undertaking, but I have to say that we are getting closer to making it a realistic goal. That is its rehabilitation.
Great. Okay. And from Steve, we have what is a French drain?
What is a French drain? French drain is when you create a hole or a ditch and you fill it with crushed stone as a way of accelerating the absorption of the water by the ground, and it takes it away from the surface area. So instead of accumulating up on top of that patio at the bottom of that WPA staircase, there's a little channel through which the water can seep in, and then it seeps through tens of tons of crushed stone. And so it disappears very quickly, and it has been very effective at solving this problem.
Um, all right. I think we have time for one last question. I don't know if anyone's typing. I'll give them a second to finish their question. We have a lot of well-wishers, some representation from
Appreciate
Utica, which is really nice. So, all right. Well, if there are no other questions, Um, Phil, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your passion and expertise and really reminding us why we love Olmsted designs and why they're so important to keep up and to cherish. So thank you again. Thank you to everyone who participated and for the comments and questions. Phil, do you have any last words that you want to impart?
No, no, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really appreciate for everyone who participated in today's talk. You know, especially those of us in Utica, it's quite a beautiful day out there. It's sunny, and you had to resist the temptation to go out and enjoy the sunshine. So I appreciate your taking an hour to listen to me.
That's excellent. Yes, everybody enjoy the beautiful evening wherever you are.